Plants Will Save Us is a podcast by the Beneficial Plant Research Association, a nonprofit organization that researches plants to benefit human and planetary life. Plants are keystone species of culture and biodiversity preservation. Here we explore the ways in which we can, as a species, use them for medicine, food, culture, and clothing. Because without plants, we do not exist. Plants will save us. In this episode, you will hear about Dr. Weil's journey with the Coca Leaf for the last 50 plus years. Dr. Weil spoke about his passion for coca and medicinal plants in Austin at South by Southwest this year. His talk was titled Coca, Lessons for the Psychedelic Movement, highlighting how we got everything wrong with the treatment of the coca leaf and the people who hold it sacred.
Well, I'm Dr. Andrew Weil, and I'm going to talk to you about coca. That is not cocoa, the coconut tree. It's not cacao, the source of chocolate. It's not cocoa, which is another product of the cacao plant. COCA, coca, is several species in the genus Erythroxylum, native to South America. I have been involved with this plant, both studying it, using it, enjoying it, getting benefits from it for a very long time. And I find it to be one of the most interesting medicinal plants, useful plants in the world. And I think it is also the perfect example of how we have gone wrong in our relationships with the natural world. I think we have made every possible mistake we could make in the way that we've dealt with that plant. So my introduction to it was in 1965. I was a student at Harvard Medical School, and I'd done my undergraduate studies in botany under the direction of Richard Evans Schultes, who is considered to be the father of modern ethnobotany and was the director of the Harvard Botanical Museum. He had lived in the Amazon continuously from 1939 to 1953, and although his major interest was orchids, he had discovered a lot of psychedelic plants and had written a lot about them. And he sent me to South America in the summer of 1965 with one of his graduate students to collect medicinal plants in the Amazon. But just as I was leaving, he said to me, "Be sure to chew coca." He said, "It is a very, very interesting plant." So I did. So coca is the sacred plant of millions of indigenous peoples, both in the Andes and in the Amazon basin. Its use in the Amazon is much less well known than in the Andes. I have spent a lot of time with Quechua people in the Andean regions, and I've also lived with Amazonian tribes who are coca users and written about that. I've written scientific papers about coca. I've tried to get studies of it going. But as I said, it is from every way you look at it, historically, economically, culturally, scientifically, medically, it is one of the most interesting species I've ever found. And it is just astonishing to me that a plant of such importance has been so little studied. There is essentially no research on coca, even to this day. And just let me give you a quick summary of the history. When the Spanish came to South America in the 1500s and saw native peoples chewing these leaves, their immediate reaction was that this was a disgusting, filthy habit. And the church declared it to be an evil, and they tried to stamp the habit out. They quickly found that Indians would not work without coca, and they enslaved a lot of Indians and put them to work in mines. And they decided it was much better to give them coca, but to tax it. So they did that. But for several hundred years, although, a few individual European observers said that this looked very interesting, that the indigenous people said they got energy from coca and that it had all these medicinal benefits, no Europeans tried it or looked at it, and no European scientists took any interest in it. When finally, in the mid-1800s, when an Italian neurologist took some interest in coca, almost immediately afterwards, German scientists isolated cocaine from coca. And as soon as cocaine was isolated, interest in the plant stopped, and all scientific interest and research proceeded with cocaine, which for a number of years was considered a miracle drug that was taken up by the medical profession and released to the world as this, wonderful thing that had no downside. And when it became apparent that it had a very terrible downside in terms of addiction, the attitude in Europe and later in America was that the source of all the problem was the plant. It wasn't that they had taken one element out of it. So cocaine is one of about 14 active compounds in coca leaf. They're alkaloids, and they're called the coca alkaloids. Cocaine is present in the greatest amount. We know nothing about what the other ones do because they've never been studied, either alone or in combination. And I said that, to me, coca is of incredible scientific and medical interest, and I'll tell you why. When I first began talking to indigenous peoples in the Andes, the story that I heard over and over again was that coca was the greatest gastrointestinal remedy that they knew. It's as important in Andean folk medicine as chamomile or peppermint is in European folk medicine. And Andean Indians say that coca treats both diarrhea and constipation. That makes no sense in terms of the way we think, Western scientists think about pharmacology. Cocaine is a gut stimulant. So obviously that would be great for constipation, but what could it possibly do for diarrhea except make it worse? And yet here they say it treats both diarrhea and constipation. So how do you explain this? If you look at the structural formula of cocaine, it's peculiar because if you just looked at the molecular structure without knowing anything about it, you would predict that it would have an opposite effect because it looks like drugs like atropine and scopolamine, which come from plants like deadly nightshade and datura. And these are gut paralytics, and in fact have been used that way. Scopolamine was used in medicine up until fairly recently to treat diarrhea. So just looking at the structure of the molecule, you would think it would have that action. These other alkaloids, the whole array of 14 alkaloids, all have this general molecular structure with slight variations. So my guess is that some of them have gut paralytic activities, and some of them have gut stimulant activities. And so the question is, what happens when you throw that paradoxical mixture into the organism? What does it decide to do? And this is why I'm so interested in this, is that this, to me, is a model for how medicinal plants work. And it's a principle that I've been trying to explain to my medical colleagues for decades and making very little headway, but finally I think, I'm getting there, is that medicinal plants never contain one element. We've gotten in the habit ever since the first drug to be isolated from a medicinal plant was morphine, which was isolated in, I think, 1836 by a German pharmacist. And that ushered in this era of going through the plant kingdom and taking molecules out of plants. And the idea grew up that it was much better to study the purified, isolated molecule than the complex, messy plant. This is reductionism, the idea that it is better or easier to assume that the part equals the whole. So reductionism it's a technique. It makes life simpler, especially for researchers, but you may gain that at the expense of relevance to the real world. So in the case of the habit that pharmacologists have gotten into is to call the dominant compound in a plant the active principle, implying that all the other things there are inactive, and they're called inactive compounds or secondary compounds. And nobody takes any interest in them and nobody studies them. It seems obvious to me that the actions of medicinal plants are the result of the whole complex that's in there, and the dominant compound, the one that's present in the greatest amount, and it may do the most interesting things, like the stimulant effect of coca clearly is largely due to cocaine, that is, though, a result of an interaction of the whole thing. Now, also, typically, when you look at medicinal plants, there is often they will have a dozen, 20 or more active compounds in them that all have, nature tries out themes and variations. It picks one molecule and then it plays with variations on that molecule. And typically in this pattern, you have agonists and antagonists. That is, things that push against the body's physiology and things that pull, that have opposite effects. So there's a kind of paradoxical or ambivalent quality to the elements that are in medicinal plants. So as I said, the question is, what does the body do when presented with this array of compounds that have these opposite effects? I think it decides what it wants to use. And that's not attributing any mystical intelligence to the body. It may have to do with which receptors are available for binding at the time that this is introduced. So if there is a situation in which the gut is overactive, the receptors that need things to slow down will attach to those molecules that are in a plant like coca. And as I say, this is something I see over and over again. There's been a great deal of controversy in this culture about soy. There's been a lot of paranoia about soy foods and their relationship to causing breast cancer, for example, or protecting against breast cancer. There are 4 compounds that have estrogen-like activity in soy. They're called isoflavones. If you isolate these and put them in test tubes with breast cancer cells, 2 of them stimulate breast cancer cells to go and 2 of them inhibit it. So again, the question is, what happens when you present the body with this? So people who think reductionistically see these 2 isoflavones that stimulate breast cancer and say clearly women that have a history of breast cancer or a propensity to it should avoid soy foods. But that's not paying attention to how this works in the body. I think if you look at the epidemiological evidence, overwhelmingly populations that eat soy foods regularly have much lower incidence of breast cancer than we do. And I think this is true for prostate cancer as well. And Japanese men get prostate cancer at the same rate as American men, but those cancers behave much less aggressively than they do in us. And I think that's a lot to do with the fact that Japanese eat soy foods at every meal from infancy into old age. So I think this to me is one of the lessons I've learned from coca that I've been trying to teach other people about, and it is very slow going, let me tell you. But I think it is a very important principle of how complex natural things differ from isolated elements of them. The human body is the ultimate complex organism, and we treat it as if it's simplistically. The medications that we use in medicine are very strong, concentrated agents that in general counteract physiological processes. This is something I teach all of the students at our physicians that come through our center to think about the medications that we use and to note almost all the categories of drugs that we use begin with the prefix anti. We use antispasmodics, antidepressants, antihypertensives. This is anti-medicine. We develop chemicals that antagonize physiological processes. It is good to have available strong medications that can get the body back into equilibrium if it's badly out of balance. If you're dealing with a critical illness, something severe, you want to be able to push things back toward equilibrium. But once you do that, I think it's very important to back off the use of those agents, because if you don't, you can get yourself into worse trouble than you had to begin with. And that's because of a very basic principle of physiology called homeostasis, that if you push against an organism with outside force, it pushes back. All of you can relate to this. I'll give you a common example. If you've ever used a nasal decongestant spray, you can't breathe. You spray a drug into your nose that causes blood vessels to constrict, and almost instantly you can breathe. And then depending on which drug it is, 2 hours or 4 hours later, when it wears off, you have rebound congestion. And if at that point you take another dose of the drug, it's very easy to slide into a dependent relationship where you can't breathe without it. that same thing, I mean, that's a sort of mild example, but that's one that everyone can relate to. Look at the incredibly popular drugs that we're now using to treat gastroesophageal reflux disease. That didn't exist when I was growing up. People had heartburn, and they treated it by taking Tums, which is a very safe preparation of calcium carbonate. Now this has been totally medicalized, and it's assumed that the cause is excess production of stomach acid. So we've produced very powerful drugs to shut off production of stomach acid. So what is the body going to do if you give a drug that shuts off production of stomach acid? It's going to try to make more acid. So if you lower the dose or stop it, there's an outpouring of acid worse than before. And this convinces people, well, I guess I have to stay on it. And I don't know if you've had experience with this, it is very, very difficult to get people off of these drugs once they start them. And they are given out like candy today with no warnings about that potential. That's, also ignoring the fact that they also have a host of other adverse effects. They interfere with absorption of nutrients. Stomach acid is your main defense against infection coming in by the oral route. I've seen people on these drugs who've gotten very severe infections from eating raw shellfish, which they would not have gotten if they had stomach acid. They increase risks of dementia. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things wrong with them. But what concerns me is the homeostatic problem. And I cannot tell you how many patients I've seen in recent years who come in complaining of indigestion, heartburn, and without a dietary history being taken, they're just put on one of these proton pump inhibitor drugs. Nobody's asked them about, are they drinking coffee, which is a strong stomach irritant. By the way, that's one of the advantages of coca. It is soothing it's a stimulant that's soothing to the stomach, not irritating to the stomach. Nobody's asked about what foods they're eating. Are they eating any other, how much stress they're under, because that certainly affects, stomach acid production. The same thing happens with SSRI antidepressant drugs, which have been incredibly widely used. These increase serotonin production at neural junctions. So if you give a drug that increases serotonin, what is the body going to do? It's going to make less serotonin, and it's going to drop serotonin receptors. So after a period of time, if you try to stop the drug, often depression is prolonged or intensified. This is a recognized phenomenon in the psychiatric literature. It's called tardive dysphoria, which means lingering bad mood due to the drug. So I think this is a general principle that I see with the use of strong counteractive medications, and it's a result of not understanding the complexity of the body and how it responds to isolated compounds that have strong counteractive actions. And I think I learned a lot of this by observing the uses of coca in these traditional societies and my own uses of it. And the fact this is just so fascinating that here you have this array of molecules that have these opposite effects, and you're letting the body decide what it wants to use. It's a different way of treating the body than giving it a strong shove in one direction. You're letting it participate in the therapeutic equation and decide what it wants to use. So I cannot tell you how the European, the Western attitude, non-indigenous attitudes toward that plant, have been so off base. The U.S. has funded programs to eradicate coca in South America, depriving indigenous peoples not only of their sacred plant, but their livelihood. There was one program of trying to get them to grow other crops instead of coca, and any people who did that were wiped out economically. Coca is perfectly adapted to the lens in which it's used. I can think of so many ways that coca would be a benefit to our society. There was a period when I was living in South America that I treated a number of people with various conditions by getting them to use coca. One was just getting people off coffee and to use coca instead. And I saw wonderful results from that, especially people that had, either insomnia from coca, tremors, irregular heartbeats, stomach problems. That coca doesn't do any of that, and yet you get alertness from it. But one of the most interesting effects of coca, which has never been studied, is it appears to regulate carbohydrate metabolism in a very interesting way that could be very useful in our society. Andean Indians have very high genetic incidence of the genes for type 2 diabetes, but they don't express themselves in people that are living in their traditional way at high altitude, eating their traditional diets, which are quite high in starch, and chewing coca after every meal and getting a lot of physical activity. If they move to lower altitude, stop chewing coca, begin eating more fat and more protein, more like us, they develop type 2 diabetes at very high rates. So coca could be a preventive of type 2 diabetes in people that have that genetic propensity. That's fascinating. We have nothing like that in our pharmacological repertory. So that's there was one little bit of research that was done by a Canadian researcher. It was done in South America, where they took Andean Indians and had them riding exercise bikes, and measuring blood sugar and chewing coca. And at any point in the cycle, at which I think they gave them a high carbohydrate meal, at any point afterwards, at which they chewed coca, blood sugar was normalized. I mean, that's fascinating, and we have nothing that does that. So that would be a very useful thing to explore. I think also coca can be a safe antidepressant, which doesn't have the problems of the SSRI antidepressants. I think it's a useful stimulant for people to do physical activity. I think it really helps with people wanting to control weight. That if you eat less, chew coca, increase physical activity, that's a good recipe for using weight along with the normalization of metabolism. So one question is, how would you introduce coca in this society? People are not going to chew a mouthful of leaves, and you have to chew it with an alkali, which is usually made from ashes of various plants. Some forms of coca taste very good, but I think people aren't going to do that. And I've always wanted to develop a coca chewing gum. I actually had some conversations with the Wrigley Company long ago about doing that, but I think incorporating an extract of coca into a chewing gum would be close to the way that it's used by indigenous peoples, and would reproduce the effects in a good way. So I've been working for many, many years to try to advance, to rehabilitate coca, to get people to understand it, to make it available here, and especially to get research going on it. There's one thing in favor of coca that makes it easier to work with than cannabis or psychedelics, and that is it's in Schedule 2 of the Controlled Substances Act, not Schedule 1. Schedule 1 is defined as substances that have a high potential for use and no therapeutic value, which is ridiculous when you look at psychedelics and cannabis, but there it is. But Schedule 2 is substances that have high abuse potential, but do have therapeutic value. And the only reason that coca is there is that cocaine is there. And cocaine is an accepted medical drug that is still used in dentistry and in ophthalmology. By the way, all of the legal cocaine that's used in the pharmaceutical industry here comes from leaves that are imported from Peru to go into Coca-Cola. And the only legal exports of leaves from Peru, they would love to be able to sell their coca all over the world, but the only legal exports go to a company called Stepan Chemical Company in New Jersey, which extracts the cocaine and sells it to Merck, and I think Merck, maybe one other company. And then they make an extract of the decoconized leaves, which is sold to Coca-Cola and added as a flavoring ingredient. Coca-Cola is very secretive about that. And it's the only, in the late 1800s, when cocaine was at the peak of its popularity, there were hundreds of coca products on the market with names like Coca-Cola and Coca-Roca. And out of all of those, the only one that has survived and retains the name Coca is Coca-Cola. So I always like Coca-Cola much better than Pepsi-Cola, and maybe it's because there's a little bit of that coca extract in it. I think it's a minor flavoring ingredient, and it's probably there also to conserve the name, but fascinating. I was in Peru looking at the leaves being gotten ready to ship to Stepan Chemical. They were really the sweepings of the floor. They weren't leaves I would consider chewing. But I guess if they're put through a chemical extraction process, it doesn't matter that much. Anyway, interesting bit of history. So the fact that, however, that coca is in Schedule 2 means that it's available for therapeutic use. So theoretically, if there were a legal supply of coca, a doctor could prescribe it. However, the FDA does not recognize any legitimate uses for it. So that's one thing that would have to happen. And then there would have to be, legal sources of it. There is a researcher, as I said, that's just astonishing how this plant that is of such importance, any way you look at it, plus this, I think of incredible scientific importance from what I've just told you, has been not studied. And there finally, a researcher in Florida, at the University of Florida, Chris McCurdy, who's done most of the recent research on kratom, I got him interested in coca, and he wants to do these basic studies, including the ones on carbohydrate metabolism. He's been working now for a year and a half to get a supply of coca for his laboratory, which is fully licensed, accredited for controlled substances, and he's been unable to do it just because of bureaucratic stupidity and people putting obstacles in his path. So we'll continue to push for that. So we have a long way to go. But here is, I think I would like people to know more about coca and also to look at it as an example, as I said, of how we have gone so terribly wrong in our relationship with plants that could be enormously helpful to us. Taking something that, first of all, completely discounting the knowledge and views of native peoples who have lived with this for thousands of years and consider it a sacred plant, and of great benefit. We have demonized it, tried to keep them from using it. I mean, there was at some point, I think it was in the 1990s, the government in Peru invited the World Health Organization to send a team of experts to Andean communities, and they gave Stanford Binet and Wechsler intelligence scales to Andean Indians and concluded from the results that coca chewing led to mental deterioration. And this was the reason that, and then the Lima government, and these are alcohol drinking Peruvians who consider coca chewing still, a disgusting habit, say this is one of the reasons that's holding their country back from national development, and that they should be preventing Indians from chewing coca and trying to eradicate the plant. I mean, it's that kind of stuff that has gone on, and it's time to stop it. So I would be very happy to have you ask me questions about any of this or anything else that this might stimulate.
Hey, how are you? I'm Vanessa. I came from Colombia. We are one of the main coca growing country.
Yes.
I have a festival that is called Futuro Coca, like Coca Future. We already got 3 editions. We got the funding mainly from Open Society Foundation, from here, from United States. We work really hard to change the imaginary and reimagine the narratives around coca from Colombia, and with a decolonial perspective, of course, because it's terrible when you get to an airport and always, if you got your Colombian passport, you are immediately related with cocaine. So we work really hard for that. And you were talking about the classification that we have with the leaf. So I want to ask you, if do you see any ways consider between Colombia any ways to declassify the coca as an illegal plant?
Sure. So the big problem is the UN Single Convention on Drugs. This is an international treaty, and the U.S. was instrumental in developing this and getting other nations to accept it. I think there are a few countries in the world that have not signed on to this. South Africa might be one of them. But that is the great obstacle here. We have to get it declassified at that international level. And there are efforts to do that. Colombia has been very active in trying to do that. I'd say Colombia and Bolivia have been the 2 countries that have been most active. Peru is a little passive in all of this. But I think Colombia has been very active. And I'm trying to work with people that are helping to do that as well. And that's the first thing that has to happen, is to see if we can get coca declassified at that international level. That would be very helpful. By the way, when I was in Colombia last, there was a product, somebody had developed there was a Coca-Cola-like beverage. I can't remember the name of it. Coca, I said, right. And the Coca-Cola company actually sued them for infringement on their patent. And I think they won the suit. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Great.
First off, just thank you so much for being here and sharing the perspective of whole plant usage for whole health. I'm curious about, as you've referenced, working with different indigenous people. I'm curious which communities and where, and also from an animistic lens. A lot of the discussion that you're sharing appropriately is around the practice of using coca, and I'm wondering around the animism and the spirit of coca, and if you could shed a little bit of...
Okay, first of all, speaking of Colombia, I lived in the Valpes and lived with a group of indigenous people called the Cubeos, who were great users of Amazonian coca, which was very little known. There's been hardly any written. It's a different form. They use a powdered coca, which I like very much, called mambe, which is now quite popular in the rest of Colombia. So in that community, it was traditionally mostly used by men. And it was actually men who cultivated coca. Women cultivated yucca, the starch plant. Men cultivated chiles and coca. But when I was with them, the women had started to use coca also. I'd say it was used by them mainly as a social recreational drug. That they would use it to facilitate doing physical work. Like they would go off to work in the fields in the morning or cut trees down and be using coca. It was very pleasant to walk with them in the forest and, on coca and chop things down. And they would also use it in the evenings, gathering together, playing music, dancing, talking, and using coca and drinking chicha, their natural beer. In the Andes, however, there's much more of a sacred use of the leaf. Andean Indians, before they begin chewing coca, typically they make what's called a quinta, which is 3 leaves that are held together like a fan, and you pick 3 perfect leaves and blow air on them and whisper prayers to them. And this is quite common to see, people, just out in the open. They do this sort of privately, but, they speak to the leaves. There's also a tradition of telling fortunes with coca leaves, reading coca leaves. And this is mostly done by women. And to get the ability to do that, you have to be struck by lightning and survive. Lightning strikes are fairly common in the high Andes. I don't know what the percentage of survivors is, but this is an interesting practice where leaves are, spread out on a woven cloth, and the pattern of leaves is read to determine fortunes. So there's a whole lot of customs about that, but there is one of the spirits of those communities is Mama Coca, who presented coca leaf to the indigenous peoples.
Has separate call-up. You mentioned the uses between the male and female, and I know also the boogie
use between genders. Do you have any ideas or hypothesis around coca affecting male and female physiology differently?
No, I don't. I don't. I think among the Kogis, the Kogi women would say that coca took their men away from them. That their men liked coca better than they did them. So I don't know about that. I think today those kinds of things have broken down. But I think in the communities that I've been in, both men and women enjoy it.
First thing, tea. Does it take all of the good things away when you do the coca tea?
Well, I'm a big fan of tea, and I think tea is you're talking about coca tea?
Yeah, the coca tea. Yes.
So coca tea, this is the way many people have experienced coca. You land in the Cusco airport and they serve you coca tea, or you go to hotels in high altitude. Coca tea is pleasant, but it has a minimal effect. A hot water extract of coca does not really pull the alkaloids out. And I think the way that the indigenous peoples have developed of chewing it with an alkali and having slow absorption through the oral mucosa, this the best way to get it. And it's no comparison with Coca tea.
Just two other questions quickly. But if you were doing research today with ibogaine, what mistakes would you try to avoid? Because I think the advantage of ibogaine is that it's not so well known. Little people, not many know what ibogaine is. Not many have heard of DMT. So what mistakes would you try to avoid if you were building a product on that, if you were working with that researcher?
And working with
Ibogaine.
Ibogaine. Well, that's such an exotic drug. It is not known here at all, and there are now, it has a reputation as helping people break addiction. I think I know people that are going to get treated with it in clinics in Mexico, but not really available here. I don't think we know enough about it.
Do you think there's cultural mistakes that were made with coca that can be avoided from?
Well, I think the cultural mistakes with coca are just hideous. That we ignored it, then we discounted what the native users said about it. Then we took the one thing out of it that was most dangerous and made that available. Then we blamed the plant for that, and then we tried to prevent the natives from using it, and then we tried to eradicate the plant. I mean, that's like at every step we've done everything wrong. At every step, I don't think we haven't made those kinds of mistakes with psychedelics yet.
Okay, last. Do you know of any vertical or any horizontal study that has looked at many different plants and there's agonist, antagonist, because we have the CBD.
There's some we'll find. I've been saying this for years, and you can imagine. I was ridiculed for putting this idea out there for a long time, and now it really has gained traction. First of all, it's much more accepted in Asia. If you look in the medical pharmacological literature in China, Japan, Korea, people get this, that plants contain these mixtures of agonists and antagonists that interact with the body in different ways. So I gradually begin to see acceptance of that idea here, and understanding that complex natural products are fundamentally different from isolated chemicals.
Thank you.
But when you look at, like, you talk about how to test a drug, or you want to do research on this, the FDA, the scientific institutions can't understand how you can test a complex thing like that. They want to know, if a plant has an interesting effect, what's responsible for that? What is the one element of it that's responsible? So it's habitual way of thinking has to be changed.
Thank you very much.
Hi there. I just had a quick question for you. You probably saw a couple of weeks ago, the Colombian president went viral for saying that cocaine is no worse than whiskey. Is that a start?
Well, I would not try to trumpet the safety and benefits of cocaine. Cocaine clearly can cause a lot of problems for people. I mean, it's not as terrible as it's been made out to be in a lot of ways. It's, but I have seen plenty of trouble from use of cocaine. But in the form of coca, first of all, it's the route of administration is very different, like having something slowly enter the bloodstream rather than, snorting it or smoking it. That's a very different way of putting it into the body and the brain. And then it's mixed with these other substances that modify its effect. So I think we should be talking about coca, not about cocaine. And I've seen... I have a T-shirt. I think these were, I don't know if it's from Colombia or Peru, T-shirts that say, La coca no es cocaína, coca is not cocaine. And I've heard people call it the cocaine plant, which drives me crazy. So, I don't, but I think I would love to see people talking about, there was, the president of Bolivia would go and drink, would go and chew coca in the UN and other places. So I want to see more of that happening, that people, giving coca a positive spin.
Okay, two questions. First, I wonder if you could describe with more depth and color what the experience is actually like chewing coca.
First of all, it's a very pleasant sensation in the mouth. The whole, I love the good cocaine, and actually Colombian cocaine has a flavor of wintergreen, which is quite pleasant. So it's a very pleasant taste and sensation, and then you get a very pleasant numbness in the mouth, and then a sort of warm glow in your stomach, and then a general feeling of well-being and energy, but it's not the jangling stimulation of coffee. It is a much more even, mellow feeling, and it's just a good feeling. And when it trails off, it doesn't leave you, crashed, the way that I find coffee does. So it's just overall it's just a very pleasant, agreeable feeling.
And how long does that last?
Well, from one chew, maybe 45 minutes to an hour and a half, something like that. The Incas used to measure distances in terms of what they called cocadas, which was how long one chew of coca would sustain a runner, in the high altitude trails. So, and then you can, do it again. It's a very pleasant thing to do.
Okay. Second question. There could be an analog here in terms of the history of marijuana. Declared illegal, tried to be banned by the government, still is illegal, I think, federally.
Yep.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a parallel there. So my question, and yet it's a thriving industry. So my question is, why is there not a thriving coca industry, similarly kind of underground all around the United States?
Well, first of all, it's a tropical plant, so it would not grow in many places in the U.S. in greenhouses. So, it grows in southern Florida and Hawaii, maybe. That's the first problem. That's an interesting question. Cannabis does not have the cultural association with defined indigenous groups the way that coca has. And I think a lot of the feelings about coca in the European population were reactions to indigenous peoples. Was seeing this as a dirty habit of Indians. And it had that reputation. I don't think cannabis has had that.
Well, in the jazz culture, there was a
Yes,
certain
it was
cultural
associations. You're right. It was jazz culture, black musicians, Mexican migrant workers, and then later hippies. So that certainly colored the dominant culture's reaction to cannabis.
So I guess the follow-up question would be, is there an underground movement of any sort?
Well, you can get coca from various places. There are internet sites that sell coca products and coca, so it is available with some difficulty up here. But certainly there are more people that are becoming familiar with it and having access to it. So I think there's a great future for it.
Thanks. I want to return Coca-Cola to its free little state, right?
Absolutely.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious if you feel there are any situations or plants or circumstances where it is advantageous and perhaps like a better choice to isolate an active.
Well, as I said, it is nice to have available some of these strong compounds if you're dealing with situations of critical illness or the body being but you want to have both available. Another one is opium. Opium is the most important medicinal plant in the world, and by far. And opioids derive from it. Although they're now we're in a period where they have a very bad reputation, they are the best drugs we have for acute pain. Nothing comes close. For chronic pain, that's problematical. That by themselves, that's not what you want to rely on. But I think there's a tremendous place for opium therapy. I've proposed, I would love to see opium maintenance offered as an alternative to, say, methadone maintenance for people using opioids. It's a much safer drug. And, that's disappeared from our society. I used to, when I was growing up, you could get tincture of opium in drugstores, which was a great remedy for stomach cramps. It's great for coughs. And, we don't have that available to us anymore. And addiction to opium you don't see much addiction to opium.
But even then, you're talking about using the full plant, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, are there places where, is this a universal rule, basically?
I think the universal rule is that whole plants are much safer than isolated compounds and often have qualitatively better effects. And there may be situations in which the purified compounds are useful.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I just came back because of your T-shirt. There is a great group that you need to, if you don't know, of course, a Bolivian rock band called Tahoe. And they have a song that's called Que la Dea no me vea. And one of the verses, La coca no es cocaína.
Oh, I did not know that.
Great rock band and great songs.
Great. Thank you.
Just had a couple quick follow-ups. There was a panel just before about religious freedom and church, RIFRA and all that. Do you see any way of integrating coca within a spiritual belief within Mama Coca, or is that a back end or just a way to reintegrate coca within?
I'm all for that. I mean, I think that coca is a sacred plant and that we've totally dishonored it. I think it would be great if we could, have people think of it that way again.
Do you know of anyone putting?
I don't know of any Church of Coca that has started off, but I would be happy to join. Okay, thank you.
And lastly, you mentioned the alkaloids. I've heard of certain tribes using coca in tandem with Ambil. Can you speak more?
Using
coca with alongside Ambil, the tobacco paste?
Yeah. That's more an Amazonian tradition of using, tobacco is also a sacred plant. That's I think more problematic. Well, that's another example of where we've gone wrong. The species, when the Spanish came to South America and saw Indians smoking, they were dumbfounded. Nobody had ever seen people smoke. All of the opium, all of the cannabis consumed in the old world before 1492 were eaten. Nobody got the idea of smoking anything. And they didn't even have a word, the Spanish, for smoking. They saw people drinking smoke. So, and the species of tobacco that was used is Nicotiana rustica, which is much stronger than the Nicotiana tabacum that we now mostly use. And the way that Indians used it was as a very strong psychoactive plant. Either they would make a paste of it that they'd rub on their gums, or they take it as a snuff. There were some tribes that made these giant cigars, like this big, and they'd prop one end up on a wooden crutch and have a fire at one end. And the men would crouch down and take one big toke on this thing and then fall on the ground, vomiting with the whole world spinning. I mean, it's a major drug experience, but you can't do it very often. That it's like something you do once in a while and you get completely blasted on. And it wasn't until that the Europeans, we developed strains of tobacco that were milder and forms of tobacco like cigarettes that could be inhaled deeply and often, to make the brain, to form the pattern of brain dependence on it. So addiction to tobacco was not really known, back then. And that's another one we've created by changing the form of it. Also, I think it'd be very interesting for people that imagine that you can control drugs you don't like by criminalizing them, to look at the history of tobacco. That when tobacco entered, when it came back to Europe, people were really freaked out by it, that because people used it the same way they would, inhale this stuff, fall on the ground, and there were attempts to banning. In Russia, the death penalty was instituted for people that had tobacco, and none of these things worked. But we have, again, that's another plan I think we've gone really wrong with. Instead of using it as a sacrament occasionally, now it's become a very serious addiction.
And like with tobacco, there's a lot of like tolerance. Is there tolerance that you build with coca?
Well, I really don't see that with coca. I don't see that as a problem. And also people that use coca regularly, if they're without it, they don't have withdrawal. They don't miss it. I mean, they may miss it because they like it, but there's nothing like that.
And then lastly, like you were speaking on alkaloid, so what is within the activation of the coca leaves?
No, I said that you have to chew with an alkali. And that an alkaline substance promotes the solubility of the alkaloids in coca, so they dissolve out and then enter the body slowly through the oral mucosa rather than through the stomach.
And is there an example of what those are? Or?
Yeah, there's a whole range of them. The Indians on the coast of Colombia use powdered seashells that they roast. So that's like lime, calcium oxide. Indians in the mountains use ashes. If you burn most plants to ashes, it's potassium hydroxide, potassium oxide, and you mix it with water. That's like lye. Some of the alkalis are very caustic. You have to be careful with them. They'll burn your mouth if you're not careful how you use them, how you put them in with the leaves. But, you can use baking soda, but that doesn't taste as good as, the ones that the indigenous peoples use.
Thank you.
Aha.
So, colonial way to consume alcohol. How it is taste. Thank you.
Hey there. I was just wondering, what action can we take to help drive this forward? And could you tell us a little bit about your nonprofit?
Yeah, I think first of all, learn about this, inform yourselves about it, and talk to other people about it, and then, read up on it, and then think about, how we can, I want to see, I'm trying to educate doctors about this and to create a demand for coca. So the Beneficial Plant Research Association, I started this in 1979, and it was the purpose was to promote the use of beneficial plants and to study them. We had a stellar international scientific board, and one of our main projects was coca. This was back in 1979. And we were ahead of our time, and I have just revived this organization. You can go to the website. It's bpra.org, and coca is still one of our main focuses. So look at that website, and there's ways you can join that effort. It's bpra.org, Beneficial Plant Research Association. Okay. Thanks. Okay, one more.
Hi, Dr. Andrew. You and I were in the same circles in Santa Fe in the 90s. Well, I'm thrilled that I came today to hear you speak because you're the first person I've heard to give a scientific explanation to this concept that the whole plant has a consciousness, that each body reacts with it in the way that's appropriate for that body. So it's just wonderful to hear you give some science around that we know through interacting with the plants, all the different plants and their consciousness. So just really thankful for that. And I've been in Peru, Bolivia a lot, and they always give you coca when you get off the airplane to help with the altitude sickness. And it doesn't seem to be like a strong drug, right? It's a mild thing that everybody uses, and it's common tea and everything. So I just wanted to say that to give people the understanding too, like you are, that it's not what you think of as a drug, but more of a medicinal that people know the right ways of using, and how cultures have known that with all the different plants, right? The right ways of using the whole plants. And then the plants, too, have the consciousness about how to relate to us. So I wanted to ask this question about the psychedelic renaissance, and so much is going on to control the plants, all of the patents that are going on about the molecules. And it's great to have all the research and the scientific knowledge growing. But at the same time, what do you think about this sense of control that is happening?
I don't know how this is all going to play out. There's so many people jockeying around. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. But it's certainly about time that, there's interest in all this. I've been a little disappointed that all of the research is focused on mental, emotional stuff, because I think there's tremendous potential for psychedelics in physical medicine. I've seen so many cases of autoimmunity, chronic pain, long-standing problems that have disappeared with one psychedelic experience. And I'd love to see that, be looked at and have them available for those kinds of uses as well.
I've seen that too, and often talked about psilocybin, for example, as an adaptogen.
Yeah.
That goes to where it needs to in the body.
Well, we'll see what happens. It's, I don't think the genie can be put back in the bottle at this point.
Yeah. One example, I'm on the rules committee in Oregon, where we actually, within the law, required that the whole plant, the whole fungi, be used instead of the derivatives. So that type of thing could be done by different states as we go along.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for telling us.
Okay. Plants Will Save Us is a podcast produced by Laura Ash, Tracy Bentuso, and David Kiefer. To find out more about the Beneficial Plant Research Association, visit bpra.org. Thank you so much. We will see you next time.